And if any of you on the call have looked at cyber insurance over the past year or so, you probably know that there's been quite a bit of turmoil in the market, both because of the cyber risk landscape and also just the way that the cyber insurance market is updating. So I want to take some time to talk through that as well. And then, of course, we're going to have some time for discussion at the end. Okay, so cyber resilience, something we hear about quite a bit. It's becoming kind of a buzzword, but I do believe that it's much more than a fun buzzword. It actually has some meaning, and it's helping to shape the way that we approach cyber risk today, and helps organizations understand how they should protect the business and the things that they should do to make meaningful progress towards this idea of resilience. So before we can talk about how we can become more resilient, I thought it was really important to spend a little time talking about, well, what does resilience actually even mean? So what I'm going to try to do here is walk through a concept that I've been trying to figure out how to build into presentations for a while now. It's this idea. It's built on this concept of a continuum where there's, on the far left here, you've got things that are fragile. So things that are brittle or can break easily, things that are robust, that withstand stressors. And this far right side of the continuum here is something that we strive for and we see in systems today, which is called anti-fragile. And that means that stresses don't hurt this type of entity or organism. They actually improve it. So that's kind of where we would love to be in cybersecurity. We're absolutely not there. So what I wanted to do is explain the continuum and then talk about where resilience fits in here. So again, the idea here is that let's use organizations, for example. So organizations are under lots of different types of stress. So organizations that are fragile are going to break under stress. So think about organizations that aren't protecting their data. Think about organizations that aren't aware of their cyber risks. Even a small amount of threat or even a minor incident would cause the organization to potentially break down. And that's why you hear lots of talk about smaller businesses or businesses that aren't spending a lot of money or attention on cybersecurity potentially go out of business after attacks. It's because they're fragile. They're not built to withstand the stresses of today's environment. The second part of this is kind of where we've been traditionally in cybersecurity. And this is an idea of a robust or very rigid defense. And the goal here is, yes, we understand that there's stress, and the purpose of this type of organization is to withstand the stress. Resist it, stay the same, don't bend, don't break. It's your traditional defenses. So think of a castle with a moat, the traditional defense in depth strategy with cybersecurity. This is a robust system. And this is traditionally where we've been in cybersecurity. Build strong walls around your data and your systems, keep everybody out, keep the good stuff in, and you're good. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily work today. So the other side of this is anti-fragile. And this is the concept where stress or this type of entity or organization is more elastic and regenerative. And it actually requires stress to improve. And you can start to see some of these concepts building into some of the cybersecurity technology that we see today. So think about some of the machine learning technology or the AI technology, where it takes real threats and improves the technology based on the threats. So without the threats, the technology can't improve. This is far from being where we are, but I think it's, in a perfect world, this is where we would head to make all of us a little bit more secure. Now, where does resilience fit in? So like I said, we're not quite to that goal of an anti-fragile system. Think of something like, our muscles. We have to put stress on our muscles to make them stronger. That's the concept there. So resilience is kind of that in between the robust and the anti-fragile, if you will. Resilient organizations are going to bend, but they don't break. They recover, but not automatically. They need some help. Improvement requires continuous effort and discipline. It's not built in or automatic. So it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of of planning, and it takes a lot, can take money to become resilient. So this is our goal. It's quite a bit more than robust, but not quite up to that anti-fragile concept. And I'll thank the author here, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He wrote a book called Anti-Fragile, where this is mostly drawn from. But I think it fits really well as we're trying to talk about what resilience means and kind of the continuum of where we want to be as organizations. So this being said, okay, so we've got the idea of resilience. So it's this concept where we're a bit more than just blocking and staying the same in the midst of threats. We're not quite able to improve based on the stressors, but we're able to absorb them, we're aware of them, and resilient organizations are able to absorb impacts and get better and learn and stay in business after they're hit with risks. So how do we become resilient? So again, cyber risk resilience requires planning, investment, coordination. Another really important factor with resilience is it's not automatic. So it requires buy-in from both the top of an organization and the bottom. Everybody has to be on the same page and buying into this being the right thing for the business. It also takes time to implement. Cyber risk resiliency and risk-based decisions are something that has to be implemented over time. It's not something that you can start today and be done. It's something that takes planning, multi-year, investments and projects, and it doesn't end. It's not something that you start and finish. And that's the last point here. It's never really completed. So the way that we usually talk about cyber risk management is what most people are probably familiar with here on this call is the NIST cybersecurity framework. And I like this because it breaks cyber risk management down into 5 pretty easy to digest categories. Now, sometimes what we run into with this is it's overly simplified, so we don't really see what that means in practice. So I wanted to pull this apart a little bit to talk about some of the individual components. Again, the idea of moving from that rigid model that we've been at for quite a while more to this resilient model, where rigid, again, is designed to stay the same under stress. However, it's not able to adapt and change, versus an organization that's more resilient, that's able to adapt and change, is able to bend, not break, and be better equipped to deal with some of the threats that we're seeing today. So how does this work? So identify. So we in the identify phase of the NIST cybersecurity framework, the idea is to figure out where your risks are, what you're trying to protect. So using that fragile, anti-fragile continuum, the first thing that you need to do before you can protect anything is to figure out what's fragile. What systems do you have that are fragile that could break under a stress of a cyber attack? What data do you have that's fragile that could potentially break under the stress of a cyber attack? What governance do you have in place to help you identify what you're supposed to be doing with your data, your systems, and how do you communicate that throughout the organization in a purposeful and deliberate way? Cybersecurity is not random. Cyber resilience is not something that you can hope to be by putting in just protections and not being deliberate about it. It takes a lot of time in the front end in this identify bucket to come up with how you're going to be resilient, where your risks are, where your vulnerabilities are, and then building your plan around that to protect your organization. And of course, the next step, once you identify what you're trying to protect, is to actually protect it. Historically, protections have been in that rigid model. So they're designed to block or prevent things from leaving. As we all know today with what's going on in the cyber risk landscape, doesn't necessarily work. Criminals are typically one step ahead. Rigid defenses that don't adapt can be circumvented. And then, of course, there's no guarantees with anything. Even cybersecurity technology could potentially have vulnerabilities as we've seen. So protections now go beyond the traditional defense in depth, not to say that model should be thrown out, but there's more to it than that. Resilience requires muscle memory in an organization. So by that, I mean, it's more than just being aware of threats. It requires individuals to change their behavior and buy into the approach that the organization outlines. Access control is more important than ever, protecting accounts, automation, finding the best of need solutions for the organization. every business is different. So a one-size-fits-all approach is no longer possible. Requires, hybrid models between, the team that you might have internally with third-party providers that are doing things like, maybe they're helping you manage firewalls, maybe they're helping you do detection and response. Either way, whatever solution needs to be right-sized for the organization and align with the things that the business is trying to protect. These elements are essential to being resilient. And more important than ever is detection. So even with the most perfect plan and the best protections in place, things get by. As we've seen this year, probably more than ever, even the best intentioned and protected organizations can run into issues that are totally outside of their control. And detection is a team sport. I have that written down here. But what I mean by that is that everybody in the organization is potentially a sensor when it comes to cybersecurity. They're able to see things that are happening right away when something, maybe they click on something or download something or something doesn't look right, or they're getting emails. They're part of a resilient strategy for a business. So it requires participation from everyone. Technology and security has evolved to become more than things at a network edge or on a server. It's now on endpoints. Endpoints are more important to protect than ever. Managed services to help businesses of all shapes and sizes are out there. Cloud security is more important as we move to the cloud. As we've probably seen, many of us ourselves, our vendors are also a pretty big exposure, and we need to figure out ways to detect and respond to threats that they may be experiencing when we really don't have a ton of insight into how they're protecting their organization. So all of these elements of detection are critical when it comes to becoming resilient. If you don't know what's going on, or if you don't know that you've been hit by something, it's very difficult to respond and react. All right, and this gets into the next two chunks of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And as we talk about cyber insurance, as we get into the next section of the presentation, this is where cyber insurance is best suited to fit. Cyber insurance will never replace any of the things that I just mentioned in 1 through 3. Cyber insurance is designed to help businesses respond and recover. And it fits best into those parts of a cyber risk management strategy or a cyber risk resiliency strategy. And response right now is more than just, it's almost as important as proactive defenses. If you've seen any organizations today that have been hit by a major cyber attack, how they respond to an attack is just as important as how they've protected themselves. After an attack, people don't care about what they did to protect themselves. What they care about is how they respond, how they portray the event, how they make the consumers that may have been impacted feel comfortable that they're doing the right thing and helping them respond and protect their data and identity. It's more important than ever. And if you botch a response after a cyber attack, it could torpedo really a business of any size. So resilient organizations today are in a mindset that they expect something at some point to happen. They expect something to go wrong, and they're planning for something to go wrong, not because they don't think they're doing the right things, but they know that that's right now the reality. And they're testing their response capabilities. They're practicing. It's hypothetical events today, but the more that a business practices their response effort, the better equipped they're going to be to do that when something happens. And that's, I think, a key to being resilient. It's not only focusing on the preventative measures, but it's also taking just as much time and effort to think about how you're going to respond and recover quickly if something goes wrong. Recovery, of course, goes right along with that. This includes both technical and non-technical elements, getting servers back up, getting equipment back up, getting people back online, getting back in touch with your clients, communicating with them about what's going on and what happened, protecting your reputation. All of those things are required for recovery to get the business back to where it was before it had an incident. But resilient organizations take the things that they learned through a cyber attack or through a cybersecurity failure, and they learn from them and they improve from them. And that's what gets us more towards that concept of anti-fragile, where the stressors are actually improving the organization and making them stronger going forward. So all of these things combined are what makes an organization cyber resilient. And this is what we have to strive for. And as you can see, this is not easy. There's a lot that goes into this. And it's not something that can be done overnight. So this is why a lot of businesses today, I believe, are overwhelmed when they're trying to become more resilient or develop a strategy for cyber risk management. And I like to also point out that it's a continuum. So, the NIST cybersecurity framework, we typically like to see that circle. I believe it's more of an ellipse, and anybody at PSA that I work with knows that I love this image because I think it's a perfect example of how we have to approach cybersecurity today. It's a continuum. You start, you don't finish, and you take what you learn throughout the process to improve. And then you also have to have an eye outward to understand what's going on outside of the environment to then be able to react and adapt your strategy. So again, not easy, but these are the things that we need to strive for when we want to become cyber resilient. Okay, so all that being said, let's take, I guess, kind of a step to the side and talk about cyber insurance and risk transfer. So a few quick things first. I mentioned some of this, but when we're talking about a cyber resilience strategy, cyber insurance is, as I mentioned, when you look at those 5 different categories, it's essential, I believe, for recovery. It does not replace controls, and it also requires that you coordinate a response strategy with things like incident detection and incident response. Organizations that have coordinated their incident response activities with their cyber insurance policies, in my experience, are the ones that are best able to respond quickly and effectively when something goes wrong and when they have an incident. Those things are not two totally separate entities, and they don't automatically coordinate on their own. It requires some planning and effort. Another thing that I like to point out about cyber insurance is it does more than pay claims. And what I mean by that is that when you're looking at the response and recovery activities, cyber insurance is not simply going to pay, give you a check after an incident. They're actually going to connect you with providers to help you respond to an incident. So the data privacy and cybersecurity attorneys, if you don't already have somebody that you're working with that's an expert in this field, the carriers are going to connect you with somebody that knows how to navigate this landscape. Cyber forensics is critical right now, especially with things like ransomware and some of the requirements surrounding that. A good cyber insurance policy will set you up with a firm that can help not only do the forensic investigation, but also help manage things like the ransomware negotiation. CAMI has members that do both of these things extremely well. But the idea here is not that it's just going to pay a claim. It's actually going to, haven't done planning on incident response. Cyber insurance is going to connect you with folks to help you actually do this and execute your strategy. So again, that's number 3. Cyber insurance, I believe, in my experience, supports best practices in incident response. So even if you don't have a fully vetted or tested strategy, if you follow the guidelines of cyber insurance during an incident, it's going to direct you along the incident response best practices, which again, when we look at that resiliency model, it's going to help you respond and recover better than if you didn't have such something like this in place. And finally, and this is a question I get a lot these days about what's going on with underwriting and pricing policies. So no, unfortunately, underwriting in cyber insurance is not perfect yet, but we've seen a lot of improvements over time as the carriers have done a better job trying to figure out how to model cyber risk, how to look at cyber risk, how to take traditional insurance models and adapt them to something like cyber, which is a lot less defined and harder to take past data and apply it to what's going to happen in the future. So with this being said, wanted to talk a little bit about risk transfer. And this is how this is part of the resilience and risk transfer topic today. But how risk transfer is done with cyber insurance is a little bit different than what we typically do with other risk transfer. But I wanted to dig in a little bit about how risk transfer works and then how that works in the context of cyber insurance. So every organization, when they're looking at risk, goes through a process. They look at their risk and they need to figure out what their risk tolerance is. Every organization is going to be different. Some are more risk averse than others, and some will accept more risk, where others are more quick to buy that down with controls or transfer it. So for organizations that are looking at risk, some risk must be accepted. This is risk that they assume and they understand, and they're ready to kind of insure themselves or deal with should something happen, because there's no good way to control it or transfer it. The second way businesses or organizations deal with risk is buy down the risk that they're willing to accept by putting controls in place. So this is really anything when you look at risk, anything that you do to prevent something bad from happening, or any money that you spend to make your organization more safe or secure is an example of controls that help buy down that cost of the risk. Anything that you aren't willing to accept, or you're not willing or able to control, that's where risk transfer comes into play. And that's the biggest benefit of things like insurance, because that's where you're able to help transfer that risk to an insurance company for those things that hopefully are not as likely and are harder to accept or control. That's where insurance fits in really well when it comes to risk transfer. The challenge is it's much easier said than done with cyber risk, because when you're thinking about risk transfer, one of the first assumptions that you have to make is that the organization is actually able to identify their cyber risk and they're able to quantify it. Neither of those things are actually very easy today in the cybersecurity landscape. The other problem that I find, and I think many of you probably out there as well would agree with, is that organizations that are less aware of cyber risk or not as able to conceptualize what it means for their business are more likely to mistakenly or accidentally accept risk because they don't fully understand it. So they're effectively accepting risk knowingly without fully understanding the consequences. And I think that's some of what we're dealing with right now. Going right down the line here, if businesses struggle to quantify or understand their risk, it's very hard to do that identify phase and figure out what your risk is and what's worth investing in protections. So many, of the folks in the cybersecurity industry that are on this call are much easier to, or are in a much better position to say, look, spending a little bit more money on controls is going to pay off in the long run, 10 times and 20 times, 100 times over. But if a business is unable to understand the value of their risk, which again is not easy, it's hard to make that cost benefit analysis, especially in the traditional ways that we think about it. That brings us down to risk transfer. And this is kind of a reverse of what we looked at on the previous slide, where cyber insurance as a risk transfer solution could potentially be the easiest thing for most businesses to understand in this equation. So it's easier for many businesses to rationalize transferring risk, especially when cyber insurance has been historically inexpensive, than it is to justify spending money on planning and preparation and digging into understanding risk and doing assessments and all the hard work to protect the business. So a lot of organizations have looked to cyber insurance as a way to really help manage cyber risk without fully understanding it. Cyber insurance, I do believe, is a fantastic risk transfer solution in this scenario. However, without a good understanding of risks and without many businesses that are buying insurance having the appropriate controls, this isn't a sustainable solution. So we really need to figure out a way to look at that resiliency model and start having some of these other pieces built out a bit more. If cyber insurance is going to exist as a solution, which I hope it will, because I really do believe it serves an important purpose for businesses. So hopefully that puts it in context of why cyber insurance is a little bit more difficult than other types of insurance out there. Okay, so the next section here is really the last part of the presentation before we dive into the discussion. This is where it really all comes together, focusing specifically on cyber insurance. What I want to do is give you some market updates. There's been a lot more developments really in the past year with cyber insurance than there have probably in the past 5, based on my experience. So I want to give you some insights as to what's going on out there. When you see probably your premiums going up or you're getting more questions asked, I want everybody to understand why that's happening. And then I want to also dig in a little bit to what a good policy should cover. So that way, when you're looking at your own policy or you're thinking about adding the coverage, you have a framework for what to look for. All right, so what to expect from a policy. So in its simplest form, these 5 elements should be covered in every good cyber insurance policy. And they're broken down into these 3 buckets. So every policy should have cyber liability coverage. Every policy should cover your first party or direct expenses. And most good cyber insurance policies have some element of cybercrime today, which covers theft of money through some type of hacking or social engineering. So cyber liability is going to cover your liability to others. This means that if you fail to protect data, your systems, if you violate a law or regulation, the policy is going to help cover your defense expenses, things like fines and penalties, and other damages related to that error or mistake or really accident potentially on your side. What makes cyber insurance policies a little bit confusing is that they blend these third-party or your liability to others coverages with first-party coverages, which mean they're your direct expenses. So if you had a cyber attack or a cyber incident, you're going to have direct expenses that you're responsible for covering. You're also going to need help from providers, like I mentioned, to help you respond and recover that you typically don't have on staff, or even if you did, it really wouldn't make sense to use your internal resources. So the first part of the first-party expense coverage that I look for are going to be things like privacy event expenses. So think of your legal, forensic, notification expenses. Good policies also cover network security expenses and crisis communication expenses. So investigating incidents, whether they breach data or they just cause a network intrusion, and then costs to help you protect your reputation. Good policies also cover business interruption. I would argue our digital infrastructure is probably now more important than our physical infrastructure. So this is one of the areas where I really focus a lot of time on our clients to help them understand the best way to craft this coverage. So most policies are going to cover local equipment and servers, as well as what's called contingent business interruption, which is going to extend to cloud services, software as a service, things that you don't actually control or manage. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because the underwriters are looking at you as a business. They're not underwriting your cloud service providers. So this is where the potential for losses and additional risk. I can see that coming. But right now, the recommendation is to try to get full limits on this contingent business interruption coverage. Carriers are also offering broad coverage triggers for this, meaning that the policy would respond to both malicious attacks, things like hacking or DDoS attacks, as well as errors. So if you can imagine a large business configuring a remote work setup, and they misconfigure something, and the employees can't work for a week, there's a potential business income loss there. And a lot of the cyber insurance policies cover those types of things, which I think is great right now. And data restoration. That's the last piece. This really fits squarely into the bucket of recovery. This covers everything from helping to restore data, restore computer programs, end the system to the point it was before you had the incident. Really important would be elements here are incident containment and remediation. So if there's an intrusion or if there's some type of malware on a network, covers the cost to help contain it and remove it and get the network secure. So that then the business can get back to up and running and fix the things that led to it in the first place. A lot of policies are covering things like hardware these days, as well as some cover betterment, which will improve a system beyond where it was before the incident occurred. That's almost always sublimited, or there's some co-insurance where the organization is required to pay some of the costs in addition to the policy, but it's a new element that's starting to pop up out there. And another thing to think about with cyber insurance, I mentioned throughout the presentation that this does not replace your controls, but as you can see, there's a lot of coverage here. And where I think it fits best for an organization that's really doing a good job of planning and implementing and trying to become resilient is to overlay it with your multi-year strategy. So no organization is going to be able to do everything they want to do at once. So there's always going to be things that a business says, this is more important, this is super important, but we can't get to it right now. Cyber insurance can help cover that exposure while the organization is really putting their strategy and what they want to put in place. So I don't care what organization you are, nobody's perfect in cyber risk management today. So that's where I think cyber insurance is best suited. It's to augment or support a strategy as it's being implemented over time. Finally, cybercrime. Again, this is. I got a bunch of things listed down here. I don't want to dig into them specifically, but what cybercrime policies do is they pay the theft. They cover the theft through cybercrime activity. So whether it's hacking or what we probably are more aware of today would be the social engineering type of attacks, where somebody actually makes legitimate transfers or payments or buys gift cards in the organization. However, they're tricked by a criminal, whether it's by email or phone or there's the texting these days too. This coverage is also expanding into things like utility theft and cryptojacking, where cyber criminals are hacking into IT resources and using things like bandwidth or data for their nefarious purposes, whether it be cryptojacking, crypto mining, or just to use your bandwidth to as a potential or set up a proxy server to hide their activity. So lots of different ways that criminals are using the infrastructure that's out there, and the insurance policies are designed to help cover overages for things that were not used by the organization, but were actually a criminal activity. So high level overview of what a good cyber insurance policy covers. These are the things that I typically look for. So hopefully this gives everybody a little bit of a roadmap as they're considering their own policies. All right, now the other thing I want to do before I move into the market updates and we wrap up this part of the presentation is I wanted to talk about a few tips. So I've got 10 here. These are not the most, this isn't everything, but these are the things that I think are most important today. So number one is going to be broad versus specific coverage for regulations. So I don't know if we've got anybody on the call here that specializes in data privacy law or regulations, but what I see is this is a space that is expanding quicker than most insurance companies can write policies. So what I look for in policies is broad language that is going to generally apply to whether it's a national, international, state, local, industry regulation versus something that's specifically written into a policy like GDPR. GDPR needs to be covered, but what about the new law in Virginia? If that's not specifically written in, is it covered? You don't know. So what I try to do is when I look at policies is look for broad coverage for any type of law or regulation. Voluntary notification is another thing that I look for when it comes to incident response expenses. And this gives an organization the ability to voluntarily notify individuals after some type of incident versus only being able to use the coverage when it's required by law. There's a lot of gray area when a business is responding to an incident. So this gives the organization more flexibility to use the policy to protect the organization, even if it might not be required by law. I also look for in a policy, again, when we're looking at those first party expenses, is the same level of coverage for data breaches and network security failures. Not going to go into the nuances here, but a lot of policies will only provide coverage for things like forensics or remediation if there's a data breach. Well, there's lots of instances where you could have a network security failure that doesn't necessarily trigger a breach. You want to be able to use the policy in the same way. Going right along with this, many policies are going to only cover restoration of data.
And it's Jim.
And not actually cover the restoration of the network. So historically, policies only cover data restoration. Going forward, I've seen more policies actually apply to recovering and restoring the network. Number 5 here is that forensics is not incident response. A lot of policies historically looked at those things in the same way. So what I look for in policies is explicit coverage for incident containment and remediation, as well as forensics after there's maybe a breach to figure out what happened and how it got in. Number 6, look for the definition of computer systems to extend to cloud and software as a service applications. This is more important than ever as we're moving to the remote work setup. Really, I don't think we're going back to fully in the office. So you need to make sure that the policy is going to respond to the things that are plugged into your physical network the same way as somebody using a laptop at home. Number 7 is coverage for cyber terrorism. This is a really insurance-y type of thing here, but what it does is it carves, typically terrorism is excluded, but what carriers are doing is actually adding coverage back in for cyber terrorism. Very difficult to distinguish between just general cyber attacks, war, and cyber terrorism today. So this gives a little bit of a comfort that things are going to be covered if there's some ambiguity there. Mentioned this already. You want to look for non-malicious triggers for your business interruption coverage. And then 9 and 10 are less policy language specific, but more about how to use the policy. So 9, carriers right now are trying to reduce losses. So what they're doing is they're rolling out a lot of additional services. Take a look at those services and take advantage of them. You can get some really nice services potentially for free. And you can also get some really good technology or other resources at discounted costs. And carriers are encouraging you to do that because it helps reduce claims. And then finally, align your policy with your incident response plan. I mentioned that earlier, but that's really critical. And it's something that doesn't cost any money. It just takes some time to coordinate. Okay, we're almost towards the end here. Got a couple of more slides before we flip over to the discussion. But I want to end with where we are with the market. So over the past, I guess it's been more than a year now, a lot's happened, and it's pushed the cyber insurance market from a pretty soft market, meaning that there was a lot of competition, there was a race to the bottom for prices, and the coverage was quickly expanding. We're now moving into what's considered a hard market, which means there's less competition. Premiums are going up, coverages are restricting, and we're also seeing the amount of questions or underwriting that's done also becoming more strict. So why is this the case? Probably don't need to explain any of this to anyone on this call, but it's really because of a series of unfortunate events that are only continuing. So if you can see that, it's kind of small, but they're on the left-hand side. So even back in early 2020, cyber insurance claims were skyrocketing, and it's really being driven by ransomware attacks. So as the costs of claims go up, as carriers that historically had seen no losses in their cyber book were seeing, $1 million claims at a pop, they started to rethink how they're rating insurance. So the rates, as you can see, were soaring even before we ever hit the COVID environment, even before anything like SolarWinds or Microsoft, which I'll talk about in a second. That combined with shutting down for COVID, people moving from a traditional brick and mortar to a remote work environment and not necessarily being ready to do it has led to more claims. Everybody's aware of SolarWinds. This sent shockwaves through the cyber insurance and technology insurance community. It was a different type of attack. It was pushed out through patches, through a cybersecurity appliance, and it even affected companies like FireEye, who actually discovered it while they were responding to their own hack. So it was an eye-opener, and it's really changed the way that a lot of carriers are looking at cyber risk and how they're rating policies. And the last one I'll talk about here is going to be the Microsoft Exchange Server Zero Day. Another one that was significant that caught the attention of underwriters. So they're taking all of this into account and really rethinking how they're underwriting cyber insurance. And it's also causing some changes in the market. And then finally, what are those changes and how are they reacting? So number one, I'm the messenger here, so please don't get too upset with me. But carriers are less aggressive on pricing. I'm seeing 20 to 30% increases on a lot of the renewals, which is unfortunate and not easy to deal with. But this is how a lot of carriers are responding. Underwriting is becoming stricter. This means that applications are getting longer. Nobody likes completing applications, but they're getting longer. Carriers are asking more questions, and they're actually starting to decline to even quote based on specific lack of controls, things like encryption or data backups or multi-factor authentication. Those are key things that carriers are looking for. New exclusions are being added. So I mentioned SolarWinds. Carriers are now adding specific exclusions for the SolarWinds Orion product and specific versions. So if you've got something running on your network with that version and there's a claim related to it, it potentially wouldn't be covered. Many carriers are also including language related to the U.S. Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, guidelines that they released in, I think, October of 2020, related to how you pay a ransom. Really important to pay attention to. And that's another reason why using an expert forensic investigator, if you have a ransomware attack, is key, because they're going to help you navigate that. General acceptance that underwriting using traditional models isn't sustainable. So carriers are changing the way they look at underwriting. They're using more technology. They're using more data. They're trying to think about what could happen versus what's happened in the past to develop pricing, which is why you're seeing pricing in flux. And this is all leading to the acceleration of cyber insurtech. So over there on the right, Coalition is one of these insurtech companies that are really trying to combine technology and loss control with insurance. They just raised a ton of money to help keep their solution out there as a way to start blending these pieces. And I think that's the future of cyber insurance, where the technology side of it and the insurance side of it are going to come closer and closer together because they're so related. So we're seeing more of that. Not exactly sure where it's going, but I am seeing a lot more technology being built into the underwriting process. And with that, I know, Tasha, we're a little bit over. Turn it back to you for discussion.